Combat sports are somewhat unique in that they're both skill and fitness based, and we need to take into account multiple factors in our training approach if we wish to attain a level of ferocity in our movements. We all know that it's vital to train with a sufficient level of intent, but just what is enough, what is too much, and what is too little? Many people train unintelligently and think that just killing yourself in the gym is all that matters. Conversely, there are a large proportion of people who simply don't train hard enough because they aren't aware of how much they should be pushing themselves. But the answer lies in balancing those two poles, and in this video I'm going to tell you exactly how to do this. I said in my last video that before any extra development tactics should be employed, like weightlifting or calisthenics for example, the first thing that we should be doing is training, but more importantly hitting with a sufficient level of intent to begin with. Now, upon first hearing that, you might think that's just a beginner concept and doesn't apply to me, but in actual fact this is a trap that is actually more dangerous to those with considerable experience already, as I'm going to explain now. But before we do that guys, just a quick reminder that my one-on-one coaching calls are back, and you can book those at the link below if you'd like any help with all of the different topics that I cover on this channel. So far too often, once we've become quite familiar with a certain style of training, we just kind of zone out and end up going through the motions, which is where unintentional laziness can creep in and kind of infect our training, which causes us to plateau. And the reason this happens is because when we're continually repeating a pattern, our brains identify this and essentially label it as important to us because of that repetition, making it habitual. And I don't want to make this overcomplicated and overwhelm you guys, because this is actually a really simple concept, but the complexity comes in when we're trying to actually implement it for ourselves. So a good way to think about it is if we imagine the brain and body like a camera that when it's switched on will record anything that takes place in front of the lens. And while our body's adaptation mechanism is incredibly sophisticated, just like the camera though, what it doesn't have is discernment, meaning it can't pick and choose between whether the specific thing you're doing is actually going to be beneficial for you or not. And this is why it's vital for you to make conscious choices about exactly what you want to achieve, and then do some learning and research upon the best methods that are going to bring you closer to doing that. And then you have to actually implement those steps and test it out for a long enough time to notice if it's taking effect, then kind of regroup and assess if it's working. If it is, then you can continue and perhaps up the intensity a little bit as well, but if it isn't, then you need to iterate and try something else. And in the case of this video, it's making sure we are training with sufficient intent a good deal of the time to teach our brains and bodies that this is the way that we wish to perform. And to clarify, the word intent is generally defined as doing something with determination and purpose. And in my observation, this is where the majority of martial artists fall short, is they're not training with a sufficient level of intensity enough of the time and just kind of going through the motions, which causes them to plateau at their current level. And this might sound overly simplistic upon first hearing it, and although most people will acknowledge this, they just kind of brush it aside, not really realizing just how relevant and important it is. So the reason that hitting with intent and purpose is just so paramount is because it activates what is known as the SAID principle, which is something I've mentioned often in quite a lot of my other videos, but I'm going to give a much more in-depth definition here. It stands for specific adaptation to impose demands, and it means that when the body is placed under some form of stress, it starts to make adaptations that will allow it to get better at withstanding that same stress in the future. But the key word here is specific, because the bodily adaptation mechanism doesn't occur by any one mechanism. It's more a general tendency of the body to do this, and it plays out in an almost infinite number of expressions. So firstly, the training stress must be in the right amount, and second, the stress must also be specific to ensure transfer or carryover into your sport or activity. And stress in the right amount simply means not too much or not too little. If there isn't sufficient stress, then there will be no adaptation, and if there's too much stress, then you'll cause yourself injury or burnout. For example, to achieve ferocity in your kicking techniques, there are multiple things to account for, but for the sake of simplicity we can break it down into two broad categories. Number one is a good understanding of how to effectively perform that technique, and number two is intentionally performing that kick in a ferocious manner a lot of times when you train. It's been my observation that too many people wish to attain something like this, but then go about working on it with methodical, low-effort repetitions, and then they can't understand why they don't magically just have that ferocity and aggression. The common approach seems to be to just pick a few things and then hope for the best, which would be like putting a random set of ingredients into a bowl and then wondering why it hasn't resulted in a chocolate cake. The reality is though that you have to tell your body exactly what you wish it to do, and we have vastly more control over this than we realise. And so what would be the right amount of intensity in this example then? All I can speak for here is what has worked for me within my experience, and it's something that is never never static but constantly evolving. What I like to do, and have noticed a lot of other highly skilled athletes do, is kind of a mixed approach when they're training, between controlled repetitions interspersed with occasional mid to full power shots. And then as I begin to become more loose and warmed up as the session progresses, then I'll up that intensity a little bit more. And I like to do this in a playful manner when I'm training. So you can see here I will move around executing the same techniques but at varying levels of power to build up that adaptation. And this is going to be completely different depending on your level of experience. So don't take what I've just shown in the previous example and think this is how you have to train. What I consider to be medium intensity for me might be way too much for a beginner, so depending what level you're at, you're going to have to experiment and figure that out for yourself. And you might hear that and ask, well, if we're focusing upon having that strong intent, then why not execute all of the techniques with that ferocity and aggression? But it's not as simple as that. Too much intent too often will fatigue us too much, which is a big problem for combat athletes, because martial arts, contrary to popular opinion, is about so much more than just being big and strong. In martial arts, a great deal of skill development comes from simply the amount of times we are able to repeat the techniques as close to perfect as possible, which requires a great deal of volume in our training. And if your body's in a constant state of heavy fatigue, then you're simply not going to be effective at doing that. But if you paid too little attention to that intent, then your techniques might look nice, but they'll have no stopping power behind them, hence why it has to be just in that right amount. And so if you've been training for years without any noticeable improvement, then maybe you're not exposing yourself to a sufficient level of stress to encourage the body to build the adaptations that will allow for your success. But on the other hand, maybe your failure to improve is because each workout you're doing is too stressful and your body's failing to recover properly before your next workout, and instead is just progressing closer towards chronic injury. And I've personally experienced the latter a few times actually. When I became significantly better at boxing and could hit with much greater power, I began to feel a lot of stress upon my right shoulder in particular because of executing numerous close to full power straight rights onto very heavy targets. And so in that case, my body had adapted to become better at punching, yet I was overdoing it a little bit because my joints had essentially not caught up with that level of power I was now able to generate and were feeling too much stress. And so in that case, I found significantly better results by just toning it down a little to that more mixed approach that I spoke of earlier, between controlled and fluid movements interspersed with much more powerful shots. But as I touched on earlier, this is something that constantly evolves because of those very adaptations. So the level you start at that causes that stress currently for your body won't provide that same growth stimulus indefinitely. So it is a very simple concept in theory, but like I said earlier, it can be difficult to actually apply in practice. Performance will tend to plateau when the difference between too much and too little stress is just so small that we can't even identify it. And in order to constantly progress, then you need to be able to expose yourself to the greatest amount of stress possible without injuring yourself, but eventually you will reach a point where any further stress will just cause injury instead of adaptation. But in terms of learning advanced motor skills, the adaptations become much more sophisticated and complex. As you practice physical skills, there are numerous changes that happen to the structure of the brain as a result. For example, if you spend hours practicing playing the piano, the part of your brain that controls hand coordination will actually grow larger. The neurons responsible for the coordinated finger actions will develop better and faster lines of communication between themselves, and your memories of hand skills will be placed into parts of the brain where they can be accessed and executed automatically without any degree of conscious effort or thought. And this is exactly the level that we want to get to when we're training and working on our skills. So it will apply in terms of the exact positioning of your body when executing a technique, hence why it's so important to practice as many perfect repetitions of the technique as you can in order to teach your body how to do it, because it's not practice makes perfect, but perfect practice makes perfect. And the said principle comes into play in all areas of our martial arts training, and you should take advantage of this because it's not just limited to one area. Something like toughening the shins in Thai boxing is also the said principle at work, because those bones adapt to the shock of the continuous impact to them. Developing your stamina is yet another form in which the cardiovascular system grows in strength and efficiency in response to the increasing demands being placed upon it. And so it's evident from those examples why this is one of those foundational principles that underlies all of the different methods that we use to train. But it also becomes clear why we need to select specific methods to achieve that desired end. Like, you're not going to improve your cardio by continuously punching a wooden board, or conversely, you're not going to callous your knuckles by going on long runs. And so the more specific input that you give your body, the more specialized the produced effect, meaning the adaptations will happen in direct correlation to that input. So that's why we need to be very clear about what we wish to achieve, because that informs the input and the training methods we select. Hope you enjoyed this one today, guys, and found value in it. Please leave a comment if there was anything that stood out to you in the video that you wish to discuss with me. And if you'd like to book a coaching call with me, the link to book those is in the description, and I'll see you in the next video.